In a small town in the Midwest, where everyone knew each other and life flowed smoothly, at the beginning of the 20th century, a terrible event occurred that shocked the locals to the depths of their souls. The city, surrounded by fields of corn and green hills, was a symbol of tranquility and comfort. The Murray family, consisting of parents and their 4 children, was respected and loved in the neighborhood. Their house, built of dark wood, stood in the very center, surrounded by a blooming garden and a white fence. Children were playing in the yard, and adults gathered at a local cafe, discussing the news and sharing laughter. But on the night of June 10, 1912, everything changed. That evening, their friends, Henry's family, and their 2 daughters came to the Murray house. The neighbors heard their laughter and joyful voices, unaware that this night would be the last for everyone present. When it got dark outside, the air was filled with the aroma of pies and fried meat, and a friendly atmosphere reigned in the house. But as midnight approaches, something terrible is brewing in the silence, broken only by the sounds of the night. Outside the house, where the fun had reached its peak, a mysterious silhouette was hiding in the dark. No sounds, no rustling, just anticipation. The stranger watched the merry company through the window, his eyes glittering coldly in the night. Gradually, his lips curved into a sinister smile. He knew what was going to happen, and his heart was filled with excitement. Several hours passed, and soon the celebration came to an end. The guests said goodbye and went home, unaware of the impending threat. Night fell on the city, and soon everyone fell asleep, unaware that their lives would change forever in an instant. By morning, there was no sound at the Murray house. The bird trills, common for this time, suddenly stopped, and the city seemed to hold its breath. An elderly neighbor passing by noticed that the windows of the house were closed. It seemed strange to him. He knocked, but got no answer. With a heart full of anxiety, he decided to go inside. What he saw remained forever in his memory. Bodies lying on the floor, quiet whispers turned into screams of silence, and scattered toys and family photos. The walls, which once radiated warmth and love, were now bloodied, and the air was saturated with the smell of fear and horror. The local sheriff, who arrived at the scene, experienced a severe shock. His face paled as he realized what had happened. The Murray family and their guests became victims of a brutal murder, which, as it soon turns out, will settle in the memory of every resident, forever leaving a mark in the history of the city. The moment the sheriff decided he had enough evidence to apprehend Jacob, something terrible happened. At midnight, when the city seemed to have fallen into silence, the scream rang out again. The city, which had recovered from previous events, was again gripped by fear. The woman's body was found in one of the sheds near the city, and this fact led to a new round of panic. Loud conversations about Jacob filled the streets again. This time, the sheriff couldn't leave him alone. The police searched his temporary home, an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. What they found shocked them. Traces of blood, scraps of clothing that were identified as belonging to the murdered woman, and several used guns covered in red spots. The evidence was incontrovertible, but new rumors began to appear in the city. Some residents wondered how such a thing could happen in their quiet town. They started talking about how the murders could be part of something bigger, hidden, even if they couldn't figure out what it was. Someone even remembered the old abandoned mines in the area, where local children played as children. It was said that tramps climbed into those mines, and perhaps some of them knew more than they said. The sheriff could not ignore these suspicions, and his team began to excavate around the mines. Inside, they found a lot of things. Old toys that once belonged to children, as well as creepy remnants indicating that dangerous people could once hide here. Paranoia reached its peak, and the sheriff had to act decisively. Meanwhile, Jacob was arrested, but his defense lawyer insisted that he was innocent. At the trial, Jacob began to give testimony that was full of contradictions. He talked about how he walked the streets that ill-fated night, but finding himself at a dead end, his testimony turned into confusion. The sheriff and his team continued to collect evidence, trying to strengthen their case. The city was divided. Some supported the sheriff, others believed that he was chasing the wrong person. The trial has escalated passions. One day, a man burst into the courtroom shouting that Jacob was innocent. He claimed that he actually saw someone else leave the Murray house that ill-fated night. All eyes turned to him, and his words had an effect. The sheriff, realizing that the case was taking a new turn, began to explore all possible versions. Every day the city continued to sink into the darkness of suspicion and fear, but no one could imagine how it would all end. The truth remained hidden, and the locals continued to search for answers, wondering when they would be able to sleep peacefully again without looking back at the shadows of the past. Despite the aggravation of the situation in the city, the sheriff managed to establish contact with the man who raised so many questions. It was Ben, a local farmer who, according to him, saw a man leaving the Murray house on the night of the murder. Ben described him as tall, with dark hair and a scar on his right cheek, but couldn't remember his name. The sheriff listened to him carefully, realizing that this might be the key to the solution. Every night, Ben checked on his horse, delving deeper into his fears and anticipating the consequences. He noticed that every day, when he approached his farm, new footprints appeared in the yard. Strange circles left by something heavy, and sometimes it felt like someone was watching him. It was as if something was bothering him, until he decided to share it with the sheriff. The sheriff and his team arranged a meeting with Ben at his farm. As evening came, the sheriff gathered his men and rode out to the farm, full of expectations. When they arrived, Ben was looking at them anxiously. He pointed to the area where, according to him, he was watching the mysterious man, and they decided to conduct a search. As soon as they began to explore the area, they came across an abandoned barn. Inside the barn, there were old tools and things that had not been used for many years. But the further they went into the barn, the more they felt the growing tension. Then one of the cops, Ron, stumbled into the basement. He carefully opened the door and went downstairs. The basement was dark and damp. Ron pulled out a flashlight and began to look around the room. Its light picked out several rusty chains tied to the wall. There were remnants of old clothes on the floor. Suddenly, Ron felt a cold current of air that made him shiver. He turned around and saw a strange shadow flicker in the corner of the basement. Scared, he quickly jumped back out, causing panic among his colleagues. "There's something in there," he shouted, pointing to the basement. The sheriff, immediately realizing that there is much more at stake than just murder, decides to explore the basement with the others. They went down together and lit up the space again. Nothing has changed, just the gloom and the smell of mold. At that moment, Ben, remembering something, went to one of the old chests. He opened it, and there was a magazine inside. There were notes written on its pages, clearly written in a not very clear handwriting. Ben began to read aloud, and the sheriff felt a chill in his chest. "Maybe I'm following him too far, but I know he's here. Every time he comes, I feel threatened. He comes at night when the moon is at its zenith. I have to stop him, but how?" These records clearly belonged to someone who knew about the creature that lived in the area. Horror gripped the group when the sheriff realized that this could be the very creature that the locals were talking about. Trying to control the situation, he told everyone to stay alert. The next day, the sheriff decided it was time to call the experts. He contacted criminologists and psychologists to help sort out this strange case. When the specialists arrived in the city, they began collecting evidence to create a psychological profile of a possible criminal. Meanwhile, Jacob, while in prison, began to lose his mind more and more. He began to behave strangely, muttering about the shadows that were following him. The psychologist who worked with him tried to establish contact, but Jacob seemed too scared to speak. His eyes were filled with fear and paranoia. "I didn't do anything," he shouted hysterically as he was interrogated over and over again. "It's not me. He came for me. He's already here." Taught by Jacob's warnings, the sheriff and his team began to study the area more closely. They decided that it was necessary to conduct night patrols in areas where it was assumed that strange events could occur. As night fell, the sheriff gathered a group of volunteers ready to help. Armed with flashlights and shovels, they took to the streets, ready for possible encounters with the dark creature mentioned in the recordings. Every rustle, every sound made them alert. As time passed, fear gripped more and more people. Suddenly, there was a loud scream from the forest. The sheriff and his team immediately rushed towards the sound. When they arrived at the place, they saw a group of people surrounding something on the ground. In the center stood a man who seemed to be terrified. He was looking at the ground as if there was something there that could lead to a fatal outcome. There were whispers in the crowd. "This can't be true," one of the women said. When the sheriff made his way through the crowd, he saw that an arm lay on the ground, cut off with a brush. Holding the flashlight, he tried to see the details. While his heart was pounding, the sheriff knew that this was someone's last victim, and he couldn't help but wonder who could have done such a thing and why. Screams and panic engulfed the crowd. People began to run in different directions, leaving the sheriff alone with the find. He felt a shroud of fear cover him, but he knew he had to keep searching for the truth. Returning to his team, he gathered everyone and began to develop a new plan. They didn't have any more time to wait. They decided to organize a round-the-clock patrol throughout the city and its surroundings. Each of the police officers was assigned to check all suspicious places, while the sheriff continued to conduct his investigations. The terrible events only increased the paranoia among the townspeople. Meanwhile, while the sheriff was gathering his thoughts, Ben started receiving messages from his old friend. These messages mentioned a mysterious figure watching over his farm. This caused him to panic, and he hurried to the sheriff to report his fears. Ben might not know what exactly attracted the dark man's attention, but he knew it was all connected somehow. Soon after, Ben started talking again about the strange footprints he had found on his farm. He told the sheriff that one night he thought he heard noises and went out to see what was going on. He saw a man who seemed to be stopping at his gate. Just as Ben was trying to get closer, the figure disappeared into the darkness. The sheriff, excited by these words, decided to check Ben's farm again. Together with him, they began to explore the area, hoping to find any clues. This time, the sheriff noticed that the tracks led them to the edge of the forest, and they began to go deeper. For a moment, the silence was deafening, but soon they heard the crackling of branches and rustling. Ben and the sheriff stopped abruptly and began to look around. Silence enveloped them again, but soon a sound like a human scream was heard in the distance. It made their hearts beat faster. They decided to move on to find out what was going on. When they finally came out into the clearing, an eerie picture opened up in front of them. There, among the trees, they saw a group of people gathered around something. As they approached, Ben and the sheriff felt their skin crawl. "What's going on here?" the sheriff shouted, holding up a flashlight to illuminate the group. They turned to him with faces full of horror. "We found her," one of the locals exclaimed, pointing at something on the ground. Ben and the sheriff approached and saw that it was another corpse, decomposed and without signs of life. However, this time, the body belonged to a woman. She had long hair and looked like she hadn't slept in a very long time. There were marks on her hands, as if she had been tortured. The sheriff felt the ground give way beneath his feet. With each body they found, they only got more entangled in this nightmarish story. He knew that more people would soon be needed to handle this. Deciding that it was time to take action, the sheriff gathered his team and headed back to the city. This time, he wanted to organize a manhunt for the culprit. With each new murder, he realized that he needed to join forces to stop this monster before its sinister shadow covered everyone in the city. They began to develop a plan that included installing cameras in important areas, as well as patrolling forests and remote places where it was assumed the perpetrator might be hiding. But the sheriff sensed that they had more on the horizon than just a local maniac. As the week wore on, the tension in the city reached its limit. People were groaning in fear as they took to the streets. Everyone was looking over their shoulder, even with a simple rustle. Children could not sleep at night, and adults, talking about monsters and ghosts, tried to find solace in their fears. All this time, Jacob continued to thrash around in prison. He was still screaming for someone to save him, but eventually he fell silent. He was the only one who knew exactly what was going on, but his words were just screams into the void. The sheriff knew they needed to question him again. The next visit to the prison was a decisive moment. The sheriff understood that he needed to use all his skills to get the truth out of Jacob. The moment they met, Jacob looked even more exhausted and desperate. His eyes were glistening with tears, and the sheriff realized that his world might be about to collapse. "You have to tell me everything, Jacob," the sheriff said with a heavy heart. "Every detail is important. Who is it? Why is he doing this?" Jacob, with trembling lips, finally began to tell. His words were like a glimmer in the dark night, like a ray of light breaking through the clouds. It was hard for the sheriff to hear this, but he understood that all this was necessary to solve this nightmare. He was here many years ago," Jacob began, his voice trembling. "It wasn't just a killer. It was more than that. He appeared in our city as a shadow, and everyone who saw him went missing. I know it sounds weird, but I saw him watching us, and if he came after me, he won't stop." The moment Jacob started talking about the dark essence, the sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. He was determined to stop this evil before it consumed the entire city. And although the sheriff knew that he would have many difficulties ahead, he was ready to fight against any darkness, whatever it was. The city began to slow down. The streets, once full of life, have become empty. But the sheriff wasn't going to give up. He organized additional raids, and every night became more and more gloomy. Everyone had the names of the missing on their lips, and they needed to find the truth. He knew that every second was important. And if they don't act now, the darkness will engulf everyone, and their agonized screams will remain in the void forever.